Larry walked briskly into the embassy. Vince was right behind him, trying to slow him down a little bit, as his rush in his steps might make the guards a little nervous. Although once they saw him, they knew what he was here for. They immediately checked his credentials and let him in. Vince was actually surprised at how easily they let Larry through. They knew he had higher clearance, but this was just surprising to see. Larry immediately made his way down towards the tanks being where genetic modification was done. Every embassy had at least one. This one just happened to have two. He worried what he would find when he got there. He didn't get any calls or any messages, no angry words from anyone, really. He worried that Gretnar would be all right when they came out, as coming out of the tank was one of the most dangerous parts of the entire process. But as he got there, he received a bit of a shock. Gretnar's mother was there, along with her older sister. He asked if they were okay, if everything was okay. Larry obviously having concern in his voice. They simply looked at him strange, not understanding why a human would be so concerned, although they looked him up and down and realized that Larry had gotten a bit wider. They didn't realize that humans could actually develop muscle mass just by working out, and Larry, being a nervous guy, tended to work out when he was concerned about something. It kept his mind clear. And he said as much. They were surprised at this, and as he asked them how things were going, Gretnar's older sister decided to start rubbing her paw up and down his arm. Along with that, when Vince was standing right next, she did the same thing. Vince was a little bit more wary at this, as he didn't want anything to happen. He didn't want another one of the Force to get hot and bothered by a human, so he simply backed away and asked as nicely as he can say for them to don't touch me. But again, as nice as possible. For a Force, this was almost insulting, but they realized again they were talking with humans, and humans were strange. Humans had an odd way of doing things. I mean, hell, they even wore a bunch of fabric. Force didn't. They only had a limited amount that only covered maybe 10% of their bodies, which was all they ever required of their forces. But this was not why they were here. They looked through the glass and down towards the operational theater. They were worried about this, very worried, as several technicians seemed to be doing final preparations in time to take Gretnar out of her tube and make sure she was still in 100% shape. They couldn't see much through the tube. The fluid that was in there was very, very murky, yet they could see the rough outline of something. It was a bit surprising as Larry looked down to see that there was an obvious tail in the shadow, a tail that seemed to almost sway back and forth very, very slowly. He knew the fluid in the tank actually moved. He'd been in the tank before, but not to the degree of this, no. What he had done to himself was only something that would only take a few hours to take care of. He only had to be put under sedation for that long. He came out and he was himself again. Then a few extra shots and a few other items that were not something he wanted to explain, but he did have a lot of concern. Keeping his eyes down towards the medical suite, he started to ask, "So, are you sure you're all okay with this? Because I'm not, okay? I tried to talk her out of it." With that, both of the forced females looked over and kind of laughed. I don't get it. What's the joke?" he asked. Vince even more annoyed, but he didn't say anything. "Oh, it's nothing." Larry simply rolled his eyes. "Oh, that. Got it. Yeah, never mind." The two females looked at each other a little confused and then immediately turned. And Gretnar's sister just was like, What? Without skipping a beat, Vince said, "The women on our planet act the same way when it comes to that situation. Exactly what you're thinking about? Yeah, our females do the exact same thing. They think it's cute. We find it annoying. But hey, male, female, it's different. Besides, I don't see old Pops around." With that, Larry suddenly felt his blood run cold as he understood forced culture. He was worried that this would cause a lot of turmoil, but thankfully, the two didn't seem to take it too bad. And they were grateful that the two didn't take it personal, as they were actually a much larger than humans were. It was enough to make everyone a little bit on edge, but of course, both Vince and Larry had been working out constantly ever since their own personal adjustments, so they were both in extremely good shape. Not to mention that, but medical technology within the human race had been noted as being so advanced in such a short time that other species are paying a lot to even get a small fraction of this technology. It was at that point Vince began to ask questions about why those two were looking so intently and where was their camera. The two females looked over. Camera? Yeah, we know all you guys like to record all this. I'm sure your own embassy would love to see the inside of this facility. With that, Larry turned and glared at him. Knock it off, dude, was all he got. What? I'm not saying something you're not thinking too. Just not the time, Larry came back with. Just not the time, okay? It looks like they're getting ready. All four of them lined up against the glass. With that, they could see the technicians lining up next to the tube. They knew what was going to happen, and yet everyone was on edge because this was the most delicate portion, even though everyone would be seemingly moving fast. Everyone knew that this was going to be something delicate. And before Larry realized it, Gretnars' mother had actually reached out and grabbed a hold of his arm and started to hold it tightly. Her eyes were locked on the tube, and on the other side he could see that her daughter was also holding on to her. They were nervous. Everyone was nervous. Screw this up and somebody could not only have severe brain damage, which takes a long time to fix, but can also kill them with no chance of recovery. They looked very, very close, and everyone was lined up, and they couldn't hear, but they could see everyone giving hand signals as they did their final checks to make sure everyone was in position. Everybody got their tools ready, and just with one final pull, the water was gushed out of the tube, and a body slid out onto rollers, the water falling down underneath the rollers and into the catch basin. Immediately, they began to work on all the tubes and wires that was attached to Gretnar. They began to reach in and yank the tube out of her throat, this 3-foot long tube that went down into her lungs to make sure there was all sorts of air in there, which must have been absolutely painful to be yanked out, but had to be pulled out within a few seconds because the body would naturally want to breathe once they were out of the water. Immediately, with the removal of the tube, a mask was put on her face. And with that, they began to start sweeping around, pulling all the sensors off and moving her over to the gurney. They moved her immediately over to the table and began to go through the process of checking everything. The scanners were going over more and more and more to see what was going on. Gretnar began to come into consciousness as her eyes began to flutter. She began to cough and choke. This was normal. They immediately pushed her onto her side so she could vomit the rest of the water out of her lungs. She didn't just cough out all the fluid that was there, but she also did physically vomit. Horrid, putrid-looking chunks went flying out of her mouth. She was desperately trying to get up onto all fours just so she could breathe normal, but everyone had to hold her down. As she began to thrash and move around, everyone tried to keep her locked into position. They ended up having to hold her down with restraints. All those inside the viewing area were desperately looking down, scared. Larry had his hand up on the glass and desperately praying that everything went well. But so far, everything was going exactly the way it was supposed to. They began to double check the sensors. The scanners went over to make sure everything was good. They began to look very closely at the chest, and they started seeing all sorts of relaxation from those involved. With that, he realized that the transformation had actually gone over well. Everyone seemed to calm down, and one of the doctors even looked up to the four watching and gave him a good old thumbs up. With that, Larry seemed to relax. "Oh, thank God," he said. And with that, the two girls looked over. "God? Who are... Is that the name of the doctor?" With that, Larry said, "No, never mind. Everything's good. That gesture, that means everything is good. Everything is good down there." With that, the two females seemed to lighten their grip a little bit. Gretnar, even though she was not fully conscious, was immediately brought over to another area and hosed off, cleaned up, and toweled down so that she was nice and clean. They began to hold her up into different areas to do all sorts of measurements to make sure everything was still good. They also began to check different areas that were odd to look at. It was strange. It was though she had not fully changed from her original form, that of basically a walking, talking cougar. Not the type of cougar that in the 20th century people used to talk about. But now, here she was, seemingly a 19, maybe 20-year-old female with porcelain skin, no blemishes at all. Her eyes still shut, but she seemed to be okay. Her musculature and skeleton seems to be just fine, looking almost completely human. Looking very closely at the hands, he could see that the ends of the hands were slightly different, as though they had almost a little bit of retractable claw left in them. He looked a little closer, but he couldn't see any fur anywhere on the body, at least while they were washing her off. If it wasn't for the fact that the Force don't care much about physical modesty, Larry and Vince were both sure that the females would have told them to look away. But that didn't happen. As he looked over, he saw that her curves were correct as far as human females were. On the base of her feet, he could see that she also had a bit remaining of the retractable claws on the edge of her toes, though he didn't know if that was actually retractable or she just needed a manicure and a pedicure really, really bad. He didn't care to look too close. The main portion was the fact that he could see there was an actual tail. Her tail remained. They had not removed it at all. It was maybe something that she wanted. He wasn't in with all the briefings, of course. It was all up to her what she wanted to do, how far she wanted to go. They could only do about 90%, maybe 95%, because there are absolute limits. You can't totally change someone's DNA. You can adjust it. Totally changing someone's DNA is going to cause the body to fight itself, eat itself, try to destroy itself, and then you're done. There's nothing they can do as the body tears itself to pieces at the molecular level. It's horrifying. But thankfully, she wasn't convulsing. She wasn't losing any more fluids except for that one rush of vomit she had. She seemed to be resting just fine, almost as though the sedation is just not wearing off. And of course, at this point, they don't want her to move around. They don't need her asking questions. They need to make sure everything was good. As he looked up towards the body, she was laying on her back. They began to move a sheet over her as they were done with their examination of the physical body. And then he looked at her face. It was incredibly human-like. Her rough brown hair was still there, but it seemed to drape down past her shoulders. Gretnar's sister actually turned to look. "Is that what human hair looks like? But yours is so short." Larry said, "No, I cut my hair. Usually males keep their hair really short, and females keep their hair long." "Why is that?" Gretnar's mother asked. "Oh, well, what's the word I'm looking for? Vanity," Vince just yelled out all of a sudden. "Vanity? Why vanity?" "Well, I'm sure that Gretnar told you that we human males are visual creatures when it comes to attractiveness." "Yes. What does that have to do with anything? Can't you just smell pheromones and that..." "If that was the case, you don't think these guys would have hooked up already?" With that, Larry smacked Vince in the chest with the back of his hand like, "Shut up!" "We don't smell pheromones like you do," Larry said. "So we do things mainly off visual cues, and long hair on a female is, to us, attractive and elegant. And that's just the way it's been for the longest time. I don't know why that is. It must be something genetically wired into us, but it is what it is. Ah, she said, and didn't push the matter further. Larry turned back and he noticed that something was very, very interesting coming up off the top of Gretnar's head. Something unfolded. Something extended. Something was not alone, as two large cat ears seemed to raise up out of her head, wrapped on either side by her hair, both of them strangely covered in the brown fur that she had before. This remained. He was surprised. He didn't know this was the piece that was going to stay, but all he could think of is if he was an otaku, yeesh, he would already had to wash the glass in front of him after being so excited. Vince saw this, and he looked down and started laughing. And not just a small laugh either, but he started to laugh absolutely uncontrollably. With that, Gretnar's sister turned, "What is so funny?" Don't take her to Japan, man. She'll never get out of there. And with that, Vince actually turned and left, still laughing, holding his sides as he was actually in pain from laughing so hard. With that, both the females were looking at Larry. He turned a little bit, but didn't want to look them in the eyes and said, I'll explain later. Right now, please don't make me go into this. With that, they looked down and they realized that the docs were done. Gretnar was now being rolled out to the recovery room where she would be given all sorts of intravenous fluids to help her body recover from the transformation. One of the major issues with doing all this is the body eats almost all the fat away, and you're required to get as much nutrients in your body as possible. If you don't, you run the risk of organs beginning to fail due to malnutrition. As they saw her get wheeled out, they immediately left and headed towards the recovery room, and as they got there, they could see Gretnar still asleep on the bed. She seemed so peaceful. Gregnar's mother walked up to her, almost in confusion, looking over her face. Gretnar didn't look like herself anymore. "My little girl, I still don't know why you did this," she said. With that, Larry said, "I know. I don't really know either, but that's not what worries me." "What? Well, why are you still nervous? She's okay, right? She's physically okay?" "Yeah, she's fine. But that's not the issue now. The issue is coming up. Something I warned her about and why I told her she shouldn't be doing this. And I'm still so freaking scared. I'm at a pucker factor of 9,000 here." "Pucker factor? Never mind. It's a human slang. Just, look, I'm just going to break this down simple. When it comes to people who transmutate their body like this, a lot of people do it out of, they want to be something else. They want to change themselves into something else. They want to become something better, and they think that's going to make them happy. They don't understand you got to make yourself happy. And because of that, let me just break it down by the stats. When we did this as a species, we initially got a jump of population on this because we don't age anymore. You look at me, I don't look like I'm pushing a century, do I? Both the females looked at each other, looked at him, and shook their heads no. Yeah, of course not. Because my cells now regenerate themselves constantly. That's the whole point of the 0 point energy. And once you have the flux field hit you for a certain amount of time, you're good. You will regenerate, you're still fine. Now, if I lost a limb, I'd have to go back and get that regenerated. But then, of course, atrophy's a bitch. But regardless of that, when people change themselves, it only took anywhere from 2 to 5 years, and there was a 41% rate of people deleting themselves. This is where the two were confused. They looked at each other, and Gretnar's mother figured out first, and her eyes got really wide and then snapped back to Larry. What? 41%? It wasn't for a few more seconds that her sister figured it out. 41. Are you serious? With that, Larry simply shook his head and said, now you know what I'm nervous about. Well, what if they get past that? Is everything okay? Yes and no. What do you mean yes and no? The kicker is most people can't stomach being alive for that long. You'd be amazed how many people after about maybe 20 or so decades, or sorry, 2 decades, I misspoke. After they see their friends, they lose after a while, they lose contact with folks, they end up being alone for a while, they just can't handle it and they off themselves. And we're looking at another 12% of the remainder. That's a big number, okay? When you bring that all together, the humanity itself dropped by almost 50%, and in some cases over that much. And along with that, we had the zealots that came up that said that everybody who did this to themselves, as he pointed at himself, anyone who did this was unholy, unclean, and should be purged from humanity. And then we had a whole bunch of people getting shot, blown up, stabbed, and a whole bunch of other crap going on. It sucked, okay? The fact that we even survived it as a species is a miracle and a half. I mean, hell, half of the wonderful oligarchs that were hiding this technology for almost a century themselves, they were all hunted down. They couldn't hide. People were using all sorts of drones and stuff to blow them up. It was a tough time to be a human. Again, we're lucky we got out of it. Very lucky. The two females looked and their jaws were wide open, not believing what they were hearing. But how are you? I mean, you seem fine, Gregnar's sister said. Yeah, I'm fine. I'm good. Vince loves this beyond you would not believe. He loves the idea of being young again. I mean, seriously, he's almost as old as I am. But just like me, he didn't have much of a childhood. Those of us who actually did not have a good time growing up, whether it be from lack of friends, maybe economics were bad for you, whatever it might be, you get a second chance, and that's what we enjoy about it. I mean, seriously, as long as you can combat the loneliness and the boredom, you'll be fine. The problem is most people don't know how to do that without something else stimulating their brains. Now, I don't know what's going to happen. Gretnar, I can only hope that she's going to be able to handle this. With the deepest concern in her eyes, Gregnar's mother looked over at Larry, lowering her head so she could look him straight in the eyes, and asked, is there anything we can do to help her out that way? Yeah, Larry said. Just be there for her, okay? It's going to be something else, okay? You're going to see. Believe me, you'll get a really good look at this. Just remember that if she did what I think she did, she's never going to stop looking like this, as he motioned to her, all of his fingers pointing towards her face. She still had the oxygen mask on, just to make sure everything was okay. Larry continued with, most everybody that went through a process even similar to this rejuvenated and regenerated themselves. Hell, Vince had both his legs put back on. He lost both of them in a war back in the day. One of them above the knee, one below. They were just gone, blown clean off. But he rejuvenated and regenerated, and he got them back, and you wonder why he's a gym rat like me. He loves the fact that he can still walk, and he wouldn't give that up for nothing. Not only that, but he now has a woman that he holds very, very dearly, who is now looking at doing the same thing your daughter did, which I'm not sure if that's even possible, given the fact that her species is aquatic, not mammalian. Both the girls looked a little bit confused, and then Gregnar's mother jumped in. So that's why it worked? Yeah, probably. Unfortunately, I'm not a geneticist, okay? I know the basics of this. I mean, you don't have to know how thrust vectoring works to operate an aircraft. It would help, but I mean, as long as you know you pull the stick back at a certain speed and the plane goes up, you know that how it works. You know it can fly. Doesn't mean you know exactly all the different shit going on there. With that, he was a little bit off because he could see that Gretnar's eyes were beginning to flutter. She was either about to wake up or she was deep in REM sleep. Either way, all three of them still kept their eyes locked on her while they continued to talk. As they did, one of the nurses came over to simply get a small vial of blood to bring in for testing. None of the three said anything to her, but they did move out of her way. It was excruciating, the waiting. With that, they were actually surprised when Gretnar's eyes shot open and she looked up and she tried to sit up as fast as she could, not realizing that her body had atrophied a bit from being inside the tube from that long. It was like not moving for, 3 months she was in the tube? And then now she's trying to move? Yeah, it doesn't work that way. It's going to take a week of physical therapy before she's up and moving around fully. And Larry knew this. But the girl started to freak out with the fact that Gretnar could not move right. She couldn't lift herself up. She couldn't even reach up to take the mask off, but thankfully the nurse was right there and was able to take care of things. She immediately called for help, which made the girls nervous, but Larry told them, don't worry, let the docs do what they do, as he stood in front of the girls and basically used his body to push them back a little bit. He realized that Forrest wanted to always be up front to see what was going on as close as possible, but this wouldn't help the docs do what they got to do. They immediately came in, began to check her eyes, her reflexes, and make sure she didn't have any nerve damage. In fact, turns out they cranked her nerves up a little too high. She was now ticklish. As her feet were checked, she started to giggle. What noise is that? Gretnar's sister asked Larry. And Larry responded, what, you never heard her laugh before? Wait a minute, is your species not ticklish at all? What's ticklish? Oh, shit, Larry said, as he simply buried his hand on his face. I'll have to explain that one later, or maybe she will, as he pointed over to Gretnar. She was still going through the processes. She looked a little nervous looking around until her eyes finally saw Larry, her mother, and her sister right there. And she then smiled. She didn't have the strength to talk yet, but she smiled. And eventually, the medical staff moved away and they said, yep, she's good to go. We just need to keep her here for physical therapy for the next couple of days. The three went back next to her bed. Even though Gretnar couldn't really talk, she tried. God help her, she tried. But it would take a while for her new neural pathways to adjust to the new body. It usually doesn't take all that long, but who knew with a forced brain inside a human-ish body, this was going to be something else. She would be the first one. Possibly the only if things go bad. Larry reached down and took her hand, and she squeezed it tight, really tight. For someone so small, she had a bit of a grip. He kind of laughed and told her this, that she's still strong even though she's not what she was before. She tried to motion for something, but nobody figured out what it was. Her mother and sister went over and started checking her and began to do what Forrest did by simply pushing their face against hers as a greeting, but also petting her hair, checking her ears, and they began to rub down the body to see what it now was. It was definitely human, but so smooth, so unbelievably smooth, they couldn't figure it out. They looked over to Larry, and he didn't even look back. They had a couple of questions on why they were so hairless. Larry simply said, thank evolution for that or something. I don't know. But now, with Gretnar awake, they had a little bit more to be thankful for. Later on, Gretnar was starting her own physical therapy. Larry was there, at least for the first one, but was immediately told he had to leave as they started to get Gretnar onto her feet. As she did not reach for the sheet to hold it up, she simply let it drop in front and gave him a full, hairless view of her front. He was immediately drawn to it as his body seemed to freeze on him, as his eyes grew wide and his pupils dilated. This did not go unnoticed, as Gretnar, for the first time in her life, blushed as a way humans do. She didn't just feel flushed, she seemed flushed. With that, Gregnar's sister saw this and began to do that strange purring thing they do instead of a giggle. It was off. As Gregnar got up and Larry was leaving, she had to wobble as she was not used to walking on human feet. She was something else altogether. As she finally was able to stand up and stand up straight so they could walk her over and put her into the actual wheelchair to get her to physical therapy, she stood up as straight as she could to try and stretch a little bit. She could stretch just a little, that is, until her sister walked up, being more than 1.5 feet taller than her now, and saying, "Wow, you're definitely my little sister now," as she sat there and petted Gretnar's head. Gretnar looked up with a set of anger eyes and in her own language told her, "Fuck you." With that, she was told she had to wear clothes, something she would have to take some time getting used to, as the Forced again did not wear a lot of clothing. She knew that humans had this strange thing about what they call modesty, which she just did not understand. But eventually, she would figure it out. 4 days later, she was able to walk out of the facility. She was able to walk pretty much okay, even though she always had at least one person next to her. As she walked out with Larry on one side and her sister on another, they received a shock just outside the embassy. It was her mother and her father. Her father had a strange look on his face. It was stern and cold. He looked forward. Gregnar walked up, realizing that she was shorter now, and she would not be able to look him square. But she walked up, and she stood straight up and looked into his eyes. She'd only lost maybe about 8 inches of height, but it was still enough. Her father looked down and was almost disgusted at what she looked. "I'll never understand why you did this." "You gave me your blessing," she said back. "Yeah, but I didn't think you would do it." "Where's my beautiful daughter? She was right here." Larry snapped in. "She's gone nowhere. She's right here," as he gripped his hand tighter against Gretnar's arm to make sure she didn't fall over. "We'll see," he said, as he looked over and immediately brought his face down, touched his forehead to hers, and rubbed against the side, the same thing they always do. This was tantamount to a father kissing his daughter on the head, and then simply turned and walked away. Without too much time, Gretnar's mother simply stated, "Don't worry. He'll be fine. He's always been like that. He's stubborn and a bit of a anal hole." With that, Larry actually pulled out his translator and checked it to make sure it was working right and then put it back in. Anal hole. He's going to have to remember that one. With that, they walked back towards the academy. Gregnar insisted that she remain on this planet and not be brought back to hers, that she would be looked at as a freak until she was able to fully operate this body. And as they walked along, she felt the side of Larry. Larry, being so nervous he spent almost all his free time in the gym, was now simply ripped. Gregnar slipped once and fell next to him, rubbing her hands against that chest of his, even though through the shirt she could feel the muscle in there. He reached around and lifted her up with one arm, seemingly effortless, now that she was the size she was. She was surprised at this, and as she was still having trouble getting her feet under her, He simply reached under, put his forearm underneath her leg and another one behind her back, and picked her up seemingly with no effort at all. And with this, both her mother and her sister looked over and their jaws just dropped open. Larry said, "What?" Vince came out, dude, put her down, put her down, put her down, put her down. Why? What's going on? Larry immediately slowly put Gretnar back down. Okay, did I miss something? He said. Yeah, Larry was still as a statue as Vince came up and whispered in his ear, "Dude, that's has the same thing as when you carry a bride over a threshold, man. Don't do that. At least not until you've, got a little bit of it." And he used his hand in a pumping motion. Larry once again snapped his hand back and slapped Vince across the chest. "Knock that shit off." And with that, they walked back to the dorms. This time, Larry and Vince would both leave and let the women talk. Gretnar brought up her interest in exploring the new body, not knowing that she had all these different areas. She knew she had a tail, but she hadn't actually went to a full-length mirror like the one she has in her room. She took off the excess amount of clothing she was wearing, at least she thought it was excess. Both her mother and her sister asked what the heck those extra garments were. They say underwear? We get it, you wear it underneath, but I don't understand why. They insisted on it, though. Okay. They were confused as she stripped down and again went in front of the full-length mirror and examined her full body. It was, as stated before, pristine and pale, no blemishes or anything, perfectly smooth. There was no hair at all from the neck down, at all. Even the hair in the back of her head didn't even stretch down past the base of her skull. The only extra hair that didn't come out the very top of her head was 2 small patches of brown fur that was above her eyes. That and something she was told was eyelashes. This was specifically to keep debris out of her eyes, though they had a different word for it in their culture, as their own species had eyelashes, of course. She looked closer and closer, rubbing her arms around her body. Even her mother and her sister began to feel up the skin to see if there was any strange cracks or bumps or anything like that. But she was still in perfect health. And with that, her mother said, "Well, I mean, if you really wanted to make the humans so bad, you could have just tied him down. I mean, that is the way I got your father, after all." "Mom, gross," Gregnar's older sister said. "I don't want to hear that stuff." With that, her mother turned, "Come on, you're going to be mated soon anyway. You're going to be hitting your mating cycle, so you really need to get over that." I know. I just don't want to hear about you and Dad." Gretnar even chuckled at this, but it was a strange noise to her mother and her sister. They still had to get used to the human laughter, in particular, a human female's giggle. This was a very odd sound for them. To most of the forest, a sound like this would mean you have a case of bubble guts and should really be running to the latrine. But they didn't worry about it too much. "So, is there any other things we need to worry about?" This is what Gretnar asked her mother. Her mother walked up, simply put one paw on the shoulder and another one down towards her thigh. "Just remember that when you do end up mating him, try not to scream too loud. We know it's going to hurt." "What? I don't know. I don't think humans are built that way." "What?" her sister asked. "You mean that they don't feel it? We need that to reproduce. We need the pain. The pinch is there for a reason. Humans don't do that?" "Apparently not." With that, both her mother and her sister turned to each other and then turned back and said, "Well, I guess it might not be so bad being a human after all." "Humanoid," Gretnar responded. "What's the difference?" "I don't know, but perhaps I can..." an even better ambush predator like them. With that, she heard at the door. They went over and opened the door. Gretnar's sister said, "Yes, what do you want?" And right there was a young human female. She said, "Hi, I'm Jen. I'm, I'm with Larry. He asked me if I could possibly come and help out your friend. Hold on." She pulls out a piece of paper. Gretnar, if I'm saying that right? Gretnar, she said in the back. Jenny immediately turned and looked and saw Gretnar standing there in her all together and said, "Oh, yeah, definitely. That's definitely you. May I come in?" Sure, but for what purpose?" "Well, Larry said that you just got this new form. You just went through your CRISPR." "Yes." "Well, he wanted me to teach you some of the extra parts of being human, especially human female, because, well, you're going to want to know. But while we do that," Jen looks her up and down, and then noticed the issued clothing from the embassy on the floor. Um, how about this? While we talk, we really need to take you shopping.